The cabin was burning. Orange flames tore through the roof, spitting embers into the falling snow. The fire roared like a beast, devouring the log walls, the floorboards, the memories held within. It cast long, dancing shadows across the white ground, and in that flickering light, a woman stood firm. Her name was Abigail, and she held a shotgun. It was aimed steady, its cold stock pressed against her shoulder. She didn't flinch from the heat. She didn't flinch from the three men standing opposite her, dark silhouettes against the inferno. Behind her, a man lay wounded in the snow. He pressed his fingers against his shoulder, but the blood seeped through, a dark stain spreading on the pristine white. "You've taken everything from me," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the crackling flames like a shard of ice. "But you won't take him." The lead man, the one they called Daniel, stepped forward. The fire illuminated his face, all hard lines and cold eyes. A smile played on his lips, but it was a dead thing. It didn't reach his eyes. "You don't even know who he is, miss," Daniel sneered. Her grip tightened on the shotgun. The wood creaked under the pressure. "I know exactly who he is." The wounded man struggled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent message of support. They stood together, two strangers bound by fire and blood, a last stand against the darkness. "It's over, Daniel," the wounded man said, his voice weak but clear. Daniel's laugh was a blade in the night. "Nothing's over," he snarled, his gaze locking onto the man beside Abigail. "Not until I say it is little brother." The snow kept falling, melting as it neared the flames, turning to steam and vanishing into the night. It felt just like hope. And to understand how it came to this, you have to go back. Back 3 months, to a lonely train station and a lie that started it all. The train whistle screamed through the Montana winter. Abigail Hayes pressed her forehead against the ice-cold window, watching as Willow Creek Station slowly emerged from the endless white landscape. Her own reflection stared back at her, a woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that carried shadows, shadows that hadn't been there before the war. 8 years. 8 years as an army nurse had taught her how to keep her hands steady, no matter the horror laid out before her. She had stitched men together under cannon fire, held them as they drew their last breath, and written the letters home to families whose world was about to shatter. She had seen the worst of humanity, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the telegram that arrived 6 months ago. Hannah Hayes, deceased, influenza outbreak. Her sister, gone. And Abby had been too late. The train jolted to a stop, the screech of metal on metal breaking her trance. She gathered her single carpet bag, her fingers brushing against the folded letter in her coat pocket. The letter was the reason she was here, in this frozen corner of the world in December of 1875. The letter was from a man named Bradford Hayes. No relation, just a strange coincidence of name. He was a rancher, seeking a wife. He'd promised a home, stability, a new start. She needed a new start more than she needed to breathe. Stepping onto the platform, the cold hit her like a fist. Willow Creek was barely a town, just a sad cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the mountains, as if they were trying to hide from the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Snow swirled around her ankles. She scanned the platform, her heart a nervous drum in her chest. No one was there. No one called her name. The platform was empty. She approached the station master's window. He was a thin man with a perpetual squint, and he eyed her bag with disinterest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "I'm looking for Bradford Hayes. He was supposed to meet me." The man's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. "Bradford Hayes? Never heard that name around these parts." A cold dread, colder than the wind, settled in Abby's stomach. "He owns a ranch, just outside of town. We've been corresponding for months." The station master almost looked sorry for her. "Lady, I know every single rancher within 50 miles. There ain't no Bradford Hayes." His expression shifted from disinterest to something like pity. "Though, you ain't the first to come asking for him." The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "The first? Had at least 3 other girls step off that train last month," he said, shaking his head, "all looking for the same fellow." Abby gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "What happened to them?" she managed to ask, her voice a whisper. The station master shrugged, suddenly finding his ledger extremely fascinating. Not my business to know. A new voice spoke from behind her, low and grave. They're gone. Abby spun around. An elderly man stood there, a medical bag in his hand. His beard was as white as the snow on the ground, but his eyes were sharp, observant, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. Dr. Samuel Winters, he said, offering no hand to shake. And you, Miss Hayes, would be wise to get right back on that train and never look back. Her spine straightened, a habit forged in the chaos of field hospitals. Her resolve was being tested, and she would not break. What do you mean, gone, Doctor? Dr. Winters glanced at the station master, who was now pretending to be part of the wall. He lowered his voice, and his words were like stones dropped into a frozen lake. You're not the first, just as he said. Women arrive here all the time, alone, looking for husbands who simply don't exist. He looked her right in the eye, his gaze unflinching. And in a town like this, women who are all alone, they tend to disappear. The implication hit her like a physical blow. She'd seen the horrors of war, the cruelty men were capable of. But this was a different kind of evil, a calculated, predatory evil. She had traveled 1,000 miles, spent her last dollar, all based on a lie designed to trap her. Before she could process it, a sharp crack echoed across the station. A gunshot. Dr. Winters didn't hesitate. He turned toward the sound, coming from the freight area behind the station. And without a second thought, without a moment of caution, Abby followed him, her instincts as a nurse screaming louder than the fear in her heart. Behind the station, a man was crumpled against a stack of crates. He was clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers, staining the snow beneath him a brilliant, shocking crimson. He was maybe 30, with dark hair and the rough beard of a man who'd been on the run. His breathing was shallow, his life draining away into the frozen earth. Abby was at his side in an instant. She dropped her bag, her hands moving with purpose, reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. It was weak, thready, but it was there. Gunshot wound to the right side, she assessed aloud, falling into the clinical rhythm that had saved her sanity during the war. No exit wound. The bullet's still inside. We need to get it out before infection sets in. Dr. Winters knelt on the man's other side, a look of surprise on his face. You have medical training? Army nurse. 8 years, she said, already unbuttoning the man's coat, her fingers probing the wound. He's lost a lot of blood, but if we can just step away from him, both of you. The voice was hard as iron. A tall man in a sheriff's coat approached, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. A tin badge on his chest caught the weak winter sunlight. Sheriff Wallace. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the man on the ground, and his expression was pure hatred. This man needs a doctor, Sheriff, Abby said, her voice firm. The sheriff's cold gaze finally shifted to her. What this man needs isn't your concern, ma'am. He looked back at the wounded man, a sneer twisting his lips. This is Matthew Blackwood, and in this town you'd do well to keep your distance from a Blackwood. Dr. Winters stood up, facing the sheriff down. He'll die without treatment, Wallace. You know that. Wouldn't be the first Blackwood to die, the sheriff shot back, and he won't be the last. He turned his icy glare on Abby. You're new here. Let me give you some free advice. Get back on that train. There's nothing for you in Willow Creek. The sheriff turned and walked away, leaving Matthew Blackwood to bleed out in the snow. Abby didn't move. She remained kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open for just a second, and she saw they were a startling blue against his pale, pain-racked face. Then they closed again. Dr. Winters let out a heavy sigh, a cloud of white in the frigid air. Wallace is right about one thing. We can't help him here. He looked at Abby, a decision forming in his sharp eyes. I have a cabin just outside town, my sister's old place. It's safe, but we have to move him. Now. Your sister? Abby asked, her hands already working to fashion a makeshift pressure bandage. A shadow of grief, or maybe guilt, passed across the old doctor's face. Elizabeth. She's been gone 10 years now. He looked from Abby to the dying man on the ground. The cabin's yours if you need a place to stay. Better than waiting around for a husband who doesn't exist. Abby looked down at Matthew Blackwood. His life was seeping away into the snow. She thought of her sister, Hannah. She thought of holding that telegram, of the crushing weight of knowing she was too late. She had been too late once. She would not be too late again. "Help me get him to your wagon," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The cabin was nestled among the pines, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the twilight sky. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, a welcome sound against the silence of the wilderness. Matthew Blackwood lay unconscious on a simple bed, his face slick with sweat. Abby worked with a methodical calm that defied the chaos of the last few hours. She'd cleaned the wound with whiskey from Dr. Winter's bag. The bullet was lodged deep, resting against a rib. It had missed his vital organs by a miracle, but infection was a patient killer, and it was already circling. "Forceps," she said, holding out her hand without looking up. Dr. Winters placed the cold metal instrument in her palm. "Your hands," he observed. "They don't shake." "They can't afford to," she replied, her focus absolute as she began to probe the wound. "Not in war, and not now." As she worked, she found herself studying Matthew's face. Even unconscious, there was a tension in him, in the line of his brow, the set of his jaw. This was a man who carried heavy burdens, even in his sleep. The bullet came free with a sickening, scraping sound. She dropped it into a metal bowl, and the sharp ping echoed in the quiet cabin. "Well done," Dr. Winters said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "Where did you serve?" "Everywhere," she answered, already beginning to stitch the wound closed with neat, precise sutures. "Virginia, Georgia. You learn fast in a field hospital. You learn or you break." "And you," he said, watching her work. "You didn't break." She paused for a fraction of a second, the needle poised above the wound. "Not visibly." The old doctor nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. He gathered his things. "I'll leave you with supplies. Bandages, laudanum for the pain when he wakes. There's food in the pantry and firewood stacked outside." Abby tied off the last stitch, her work complete. "Thank you," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "But why are you helping us? You don't know me." And the sheriff made it perfectly clear that helping him, she nodded toward Matthew, is a bad idea. Dr. Winters was silent for a long moment, his hand on the cabin door. "This cabin belonged to my sister," he said, his voice heavy. "Elizabeth Blackwood." He looked over at the unconscious man on the bed. "Matthew is her nephew, her only family." He paused, his eyes hardening. "Sheriff Wallace and his kind would let that boy bleed out in the street just because of his name. I won't." After he left, Abby moved through the cabin, making it hospitable. She stoked the fire, heated water, and searched for clean linens. In a dresser drawer, her fingers brushed against a small wooden picture frame. She pulled it out. It was a photograph of a young woman with a small boy, no older than 5. On the back, written in faded ink, were 2 names, Elizabeth and Matthew, 1855. She studied the image. The woman, Elizabeth, had kind eyes and a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy who would grow up to be the man now fighting for his life in the next room. She placed the photograph on the bedside table. The cabin was simple but well kept, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment, not been gone for a decade. Books lined the shelves. A rocking chair sat by the fire. It was a place of peace. A soft groan pulled her from her thoughts. Matthew. His eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, then sharpened with pain and a deep, gut-wrenching confusion. He tried to sit up. "Don't," Abby said, moving quickly to his side. "You'll tear your stitches." His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a strength that shocked her. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice rough. "Abigail Hayes," she said, keeping her own voice calm and even, the same tone she'd used 1,000 times with wounded soldiers waking up in hell. "I'm a nurse. You were shot. Dr. Winters brought us here, to his sister's cabin." Matthew's eyes darted around the room, and a flicker of recognition dawned. Elizabeth's place. His grip on her wrist loosened, but he didn't let go. His eyes searched hers, looking for something that wasn't there. "Rebecca," he whispered. Thank God. Rebecca. The name hit Abby with an unexpected jolt. Of course. Of course he was married. The realization shouldn't have been a disappointment, but it was. I'm not Rebecca, she said gently. His eyes held hers for a long moment, a storm of unreadable emotions passing through them. Then they closed, and exhaustion finally claimed him. His hand slipped from her wrist, but she could still feel the ghost of his touch on her skin. Abby sat beside him in the growing darkness, listening to the sound of his breathing, steady now. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the world in a blanket of white silence. She was stranded. Miles from anywhere, in a dead woman's cabin, with a wounded stranger who thought she was his wife. She pulled the letter from her pocket, the one from the man who didn't exist, and held it up to the firelight. The handwriting was neat, the words so full of hope and promise. All of it a lie. She crumpled the letter in her fist and tossed it into the flames. She watched as the paper blackened and curled, the promises turning to ash. Dawn broke clear and cold, the morning sun glinting off snow-laden branches. Abby woke up in the rocking chair, a stiff crick in her neck. She dozed fitfully, checking on Matthew every hour. His fever had risen through the night, then finally broken near morning. A good sign. She built up the fire, moving quietly, her routine as familiar as breathing. Check the patient, prepare supplies, maintain order. It was the only way she knew how to face the chaos. You're still here. Matthew's voice startled her. She turned. He was watching her, propped up slightly against the pillows. His color was better. His eyes were clear. Did you expect me to leave? She asked, pouring hot water into a cup for tea. Most would, he said, his voice still raspy, especially after hearing my name. He tried to sit up further, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. She brought him the tea, laced with willow bark for the pain. The sheriff seems to have some very strong opinions about the Blackwood name. A bitter smile touched Matthew's lips. Wallace has his reasons. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. You didn't answer my question. Why are you still here? Abby thought for a moment. She could lie. She could invent a story, but she was tired of lies. Because you needed help, she said simply, and because I have nowhere else to go. His eyes narrowed, assessing her. You're not from around here. No, I came from back east, Pennsylvania. She busied herself checking his bandages, unwilling to admit just how completely she'd been fooled. The wound looks clean, no sign of infection. You've done this before, he observed. Yes, she said. The war. She didn't elaborate. Some things couldn't be explained to people who hadn't lived them. He seemed to understand. He finished the bitter tea, his eyes never leaving her face. Thank you, he said finally, for not leaving me to die. The simple, honest gratitude caught her off guard. You're welcome. Later that morning, Dr. Winters returned. He brought more supplies and he brought news. People are asking questions, he said quietly to Abby while Matthew was asleep. About you, about where Matthew might have gone. His eyes were troubled. Daniel Blackwood has men searching everywhere. Daniel? Abby asked. Matthew's older brother. The doctor glanced toward the bed. I should warn you, Miss Hayes. There's bad blood between them. Worse than a simple family quarrel. His expression darkened. He's the one who shot Matthew. Abby felt a chill run down her spine. A man who would shoot his own brother was capable of anything. Be careful, the doctor warned. The Blackwoods, they own half this valley. Or they did. Daniel. He sold off land, made deals with the railroad. He's a dangerous man. Abby thought of the photograph, the kind-eyed woman and the small boy. What happened to your sister? To Elizabeth? Pain flashed across the old doctor's face, raw and fresh even after a decade. She was found dead, in her garden, 10 years ago. He paused. They called it an accident. But you don't believe that, Abby stated. It wasn't a question. I believe very little in this town happens by accident, Miss Hayes. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Medicine, food, I'll be back when I can. After he left, Abby unwrapped the package. Beneath the bandages and tins of food, there was a small leather-bound book. A ledger. She opened it. Inside, in neat, elegant handwriting, were entries dating back 15 years. Names of women. Next to each name, there were notes. Safe passage to Denver. Placement with the Wilsons. Return fare east. The pieces started to click into place. Elizabeth Blackwood hadn't just lived in this cabin. She had been running something. Something secret. Something dangerous. She was so absorbed in the ledger that she didn't hear Matthew stir until he spoke. "You should leave." His voice was stronger now. He was watching her, his blue eyes intense. "As soon as I can move, I'm gone. Daniel won't stop looking for me. It's not safe for you here." Abby held up the ledger. "Is this why he shot you? Because of what your aunt was doing?" Matthew's expression sharpened. "What do you know about Elizabeth?" "Only what I've found here. She was helping women, wasn't she? Women like me. Women who were brought here under false pretenses." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the book in her hands. "Yes," he finally said. "And after she died, my wife Rebecca, she continued her work." Another jolt, the name he'd whispered when he first woke up. The pain that crossed his face now was deeper than any physical wound. "And where is Rebecca now?" Abby asked, her voice soft. "Dead," he said, the word like a stone. 6 months ago, she was helping a girl escape from one of Daniel's work camps. They caught her." His voice hardened into something brutal. "Daniel said it was an unfortunate accident, just like Elizabeth." Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. "That's why he wants you dead. You know everything he's doing." "I know everything," Matthew confirmed, his eyes locking with hers. "Every girl he's lured here, every acre of land he's stolen, every dirty deal he's made with the railroad." His hand clenched into a fist on the blanket. "And I have the proof." A soft, hesitant knock on the cabin door made them both freeze. Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved silently to the window, peering through a small gap in the frosted glass. A young woman stood on the porch, no more than 18, shivering in a coat that was far too thin for a Montana winter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Who is it?" Matthew asked, already trying to push himself up. "A girl," Abby whispered back, her hand hesitating on the door latch. "Let her in," Matthew said, his voice urgent. "Quickly." Abby opened the door. The girl practically fell inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with her. Her lips were blue and she was trembling uncontrollably. "Elizabeth," she gasped, her eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. "They told me to find Elizabeth." Abby and Matthew exchanged a look that said their world had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Elizabeth had been dead for 10 years. "My name is Mary," the girl whispered, huddled by the fire, a tin cup of hot tea trembling in her hands. Abby wrapped a thick wool blanket around her thin shoulders. "You're safe here, Mary. But Elizabeth is gone." The girl looked from Abby to Matthew, confusion warring with fear in her eyes. "But the woman in town, she told me if I got into trouble, I should run to Elizabeth's cabin. She said to mention her name. My aunt's network is still alive," Matthew explained from the bed, his voice gentle. "People who knew her, who believed in what she did. They still help girls like you escape. Dr. Winters must have been the one who sent you here." Mary nodded slowly, the warmth of the fire finally starting to chase some of the chill from her bones. "A man came to our town, back in Ohio. He said he was representing wealthy ranchers looking for wives." Her voice broke, and a tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "When we got here, there were no ranches, just a camp, and men. So many men." Abby felt a wave of nausea. She thought of the letter she had burned, the neat handwriting, the false promises. She thought of how close she had come to sharing Mary's fate. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a system, a trap. "How did you get away?" she asked. "One of the women," Mary said, wiping her eyes. "She's been there for a while. She saw how scared I was. She told me about a doctor in town who would help. She told me to say Elizabeth's name." "You're safe now," Abby assured her, even as the words felt like a lie. How safe could any of them be, with Daniel Blackwood's men scouring the countryside? Matthew met Abby's gaze over Mary's head. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own near miss, and something else, a quiet, burning determination that mirrored the resolve growing in her own heart. That night, Mary slept in Elizabeth's bed, the first real sleep she'd had in weeks. Matthew dozed in a chair by the fire, his revolver close at hand. Abby stood at the window, watching the endless dance of the snowflakes in the darkness. Her entire world had shrunk to this single room. This cabin, these people, this fight she hadn't asked for, but couldn't turn away from. She thought of Hannah, and the anger she felt was a hot, sharp thing. She thought of the battlefield hospitals where she had learned a brutal truth. Sometimes survival wasn't about enduring. It was about fighting back. Maybe she hadn't found what she came to Willow Creek looking for. Maybe she had found something far more important. Days bled into one another, marked by the simple rhythms of survival and recovery. Matthew grew stronger. Soon he could stand, then take a few steps, his hand braced against the rough-hewn walls. Mary, her terror slowly giving way to a fragile hope, helped Abby around the cabin. Abby spent hours with Elizabeth's ledgers and letters, piecing together the true scale of her operation. It was an underground railroad for women, a network of safe houses and secret sympathizers stretching all the way to the coast. After Elizabeth's death, Rebecca had taken the reins, with Matthew at her side. She was fearless, Matthew said one evening, watching Abby trace a route on one of the maps. Rebecca. She would ride out in the middle of a blizzard if it meant bringing a girl to safety. In the warm firelight, with his guard down, he looked younger. You loved her very much. She saved me, he said simply. After Elizabeth died, I was lost, angry. I wanted to burn Daniel's world to the ground. A shadow crossed his face. Rebecca showed me a better way to fight, a way that built things up instead of just tearing them down. And now? Abby asked softly. Now I have this, he said, nodding toward a locked metal box she hadn't noticed before, tucked under the bed. The proof I told you about. Records of every transaction, every land deal Daniel made with the railroad, every girl brought into his camps. His jaw tightened. I just need to get it to the federal marshal in Helena. Mary, who had been quietly mending a tear in her dress, looked up. Is that why they're trying to kill you? Because of what's in that box? Matthew nodded. Daniel knows I have it. He's been trying to find it for months. Where did you get it? Abby asked. A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. I stole it from his office. It's the last place he'd ever think to look for it now. The conversation was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Fast. Abby's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window, her hand already reaching for the shotgun propped against the wall. But the figure dismounting from the horse was familiar. It was Dr. Winters. She threw the door open before he could knock. The old doctor stamped the snow from his boots, his face grim. We have a problem, he said without preamble. A big one. Daniel knows Matthew's alive. Someone in town talked. He's having every cabin, every homestead within 20 miles searched. Matthew was on his feet, his face pale but resolute. We have to move, now. It's not safe for any of you here. You're not strong enough, Abby protested. I've been shot before, Matthew said, a grimness in his voice that made her believe him. I'll manage. Dr. Winters shook his head. Running won't solve anything, son. Daniel will never stop. Not until he has those records, or you're dead. Then what do you suggest? Matthew demanded. We just stay here and wait for him to find us? I suggest, the doctor said, his voice low and steady, that we fight back. Abby looked from the determined young man to the resolute old doctor. There was more to this story. Years of history, of pain, simmering just beneath the surface. What aren't you telling us? She asked. Dr. Winters sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of years. Daniel isn't just trafficking women and stealing land. He's part of something much bigger. The railroad wants to build a new line straight through this valley, right through land that belongs to settlers. Legal settlers with deeds. So they're forcing them out, Abby surmised, the cold logic of it chilling her to the bone. By any means necessary, the doctor confirmed, his eyes hard as flint. Threats, violence, fake legal notices. And the women Daniel brings in, some of them end up in the railroad work camps. Others are used as leverage, a way to silence families back east who might ask too many questions. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. And no one stops him? Sheriff Wallace is in Daniel's pocket. So is the local judge. Anyone who speaks out, well, they tend to have accidents. The doctor's gaze met Matthew's. Like Elizabeth, like Rebecca. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Mary needs to leave, Matthew said finally, his voice tight. Tonight, it's not safe for her here. Dr. Winters nodded. I'll take her to the Hendersons' farm. They're part of the network. They can get her on the morning stage to Bozeman. After they left, disappearing into the swirling snow, Abby and Matthew were alone again in the deepening shadows. She lit the lamps, their warm glow a small defiance against the vast darkness outside. Why did you really come to Willow Creek, Abigail? Matthew asked, the first time he'd used her full name. The question caught her off guard. I told you. I answered an advertisement. She moved to the fire, adding another log, unable to look at him. A man named Bradford Hayes was looking for a wife. Matthew's expression darkened. Bradford Hayes doesn't exist. I know that now, she said, the bitterness sharp in her voice. It's Daniel's method, he explained, his voice softer now. He has men who write those letters. They target women they think are vulnerable. Widows, women without family to look for them. Abby thought of herself. No family left since Hannah died. Years spent moving from one battlefield to another. Rootless, alone, the perfect target. Who did you lose, Abby? He asked gently. The question pierced the armor she had worn for so long. She hadn't spoken Hannah's name to anyone. My sister, she whispered, the words barely audible. Influenza, 6 months ago. She swallowed hard, the grief a physical lump in her throat. I sold my father's pocket watch to pay for a doctor. But the doctor, he never came. The admission broke something loose inside her, a dam of pain she'd held back for months. I couldn't save her. I spent years saving strangers on battlefields, but I couldn't save my own sister. That's why you saved me, Matthew said quietly. It wasn't a question. She looked at him then, really looked at him, at this man who had lost so much, who carried so many scars, both inside and out, and yet still found the strength to fight. Yes, she admitted, but also because no one else would. In the silence that followed, something shifted between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. They were two broken people, clinging to the wreckage of their lives. But for the first time, in this tiny cabin, in the heart of a rising storm, they weren't alone. The storm hit just after midnight, a blizzard that descended from the mountains with the fury of a vengeful god. Snow fell so thick and fast it was like a solid white curtain, and the wind shrieked like a banshee around the cabin's eaves. Abby and Matthew worked through the night, preparing for the inevitable. They had one rifle, the shotgun that had belonged to Elizabeth, and Matthew's revolver. It wasn't much against a small army of hired guns. As the first gray light of dawn tried to pierce the storm, they sat at the small table, a map of the valley spread between them. If we need to run, Matthew said, his finger tracing a faint line through the mountains, this is the route. It avoids the main trails, places Daniel's men would be watching. We won't get separated, Abby said, her voice more firm than she felt. He didn't argue, but the look in his eyes said they both knew how easily that could happen. The storm was a blessing and a curse. It would slow Daniel's men, but it would also trap them. They were isolated, cut off. Hours passed. The storm raged. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Abby's veins. Sometime in the afternoon, Matthew was cleaning Elizabeth's shotgun when he stopped, his hand still. You know, he said, his voice quiet, you remind me of her sometimes, Rebecca. He looked at Abby, and the pain in his eyes was still raw. She never backed down from a fight either. Abby didn't know what to say. Was it a compliment? Or just a reminder that she was standing in a dead woman's shadow? Before she could answer, He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. "I found this among her things," he said, holding it out to her. "She always carried it. Said it belonged to someone who needed to know their time wasn't up yet." Abby took the locket. It was heavy in her palm. It wasn't her father's pocket watch, of course it wasn't. But the weight, the feel of the cool silver, it made her throat tighten. "It's beautiful," she managed. "Keep it," he said. I think she would have wanted you to have it." He turned back to the shotgun, leaving her with the locket. She opened it. It was empty. But inside the cover, a tiny inscription caught the firelight. It was faded, almost worn away, but she could just make out the letters. To E.W. Time reveals truth. E.W. Not Elizabeth Blackwood. Her initials would have been E.B. Another mystery in a house full of them. She closed the locket, its weight a small comfort in her hand. She felt a strange connection to these women she had never met. Elizabeth, Rebecca, women who had fought and died in this very place. As she clutched the locket, she made a silent promise. To Hannah, to Elizabeth and Rebecca, to herself. She would see this through, whatever it took. The sound came late that night, almost lost in the howling wind. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic thudding against the side of the cabin. Matthew was on his feet in an instant, rifle in his hand, his eyes wide. Abby grabbed the shotgun. They stood in the center of the room, backs together, listening. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of someone trying to dig through the snow piled against the wall. "They're here," Matthew whispered, his voice grim. The digging stopped. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. A minute passed, then another. Then a heavy fist pounded on the door, making the whole cabin shake. "Blackwood!" a voice roared over the wind. "We know you're in there. Your brother wants a word." Matthew's jaw tightened. He motioned for Abby to move toward the small bedroom, mouthing the words, "Hide, now." She shook her head, her grip on the shotgun unwavering. She would not hide. Not this time. Another crash against the door. This time wood splintered. They were breaking it down. Matthew raised his rifle. Abby raised the shotgun. Their eyes met across the small room, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it. The final impact never came. Instead, a new voice called out, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the storm. "Jenkins, what in the hell do you think you're doing at my sister's cabin?" Dr. Winters. Confusion rippled through the cabin. They could hear muffled voices from outside. Jenkins, the man who had been trying to break down the door, sounded surprised, defensive. "Doc, didn't expect to see you out in this mess. We're just looking for Matthew Blackwood. Daniel's worried about him." "Is that why you're breaking down my door?" The doctor's voice was like frozen steel. "This cabin belongs to my family. You have no right to be here. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of receding hoofbeats swallowed by the storm. A moment later, the door opened, and Dr. Winters stepped inside, a blizzard of snow swirling in with him. "That was too close," he said, brushing ice from his white beard. "How did you know they'd be here?" Abby asked, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the shotgun. "I didn't. I saw their tracks on my way back with more supplies." The doctor moved to the fire, his face etched with worry. "We're out of time. They know where you are. You can't stay here another night." "We can't leave in this storm," Matthew argued. "We'd freeze to death in an hour." "You won't have to," the doctor said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a folded yellowed piece of paper. "This is a map of the old mining tunnels. They run from the North Ridge all the way to the valley floor. Daniel's men don't know about them. They were abandoned decades ago." Abby looked at the map. It was a labyrinth of faded lines and strange markings. "Are they safe?" "Safe enough," the doctor said, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "Elizabeth used them to move women out of the valley without being seen." He looked at Matthew. "There's a man who lives in a cabin near the North Tunnel entrance. Jacob Miller, an old prospector. He knows these mountains better than anyone. Elizabeth trusted him with her life. The plan was desperate, insane, but it was the only one they had. They would leave at nightfall. They would use the cover of the storm to reach the tunnels, find this Jacob Miller, and somehow make their way to Helena. As Abby packed the few supplies they could carry, her fingers brushed against the locket Matthew had given her. Time reveals truth. Perhaps it was finally revealing hers. She wasn't meant to be some mail-order bride. She was meant to be a fighter, a survivor, just like Elizabeth, just like Rebecca. They stepped out of the cabin and into the heart of the storm. The wind tore at them, the snow a blinding white wall. Dr. Winters led the way, a single lantern cutting a pathetic hole in the oppressive darkness. It was a journey into the unknown, into the belly of the earth, with killers on their trail and only a fragile, flickering hope to light their way. The world outside was a nightmare of wind and snow, but inside the tunnel, a sudden, shocking silence descended. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and something ancient, something forgotten. Dr. Winter's lantern cast huge, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "Miller's cabin is 2 miles down this passage," the doctor said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I sent word through the network. He'll be expecting you." He handed them a small bundle of supplies and medicine for Matthew's wound. "Be careful," he warned. "Daniel won't let a little storm stop him for long." Then he was gone, swallowed by the white fury they had just escaped. They were alone. Just Abby, Matthew, and a single lantern against miles of darkness. "We should move," Matthew said, his voice tight. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps the only sound in that timeless, underground world. The tunnel stretched on, a straight, dark line into nothingness. Occasionally, they passed smaller side passages, black mouths leading to God knows where. To break the oppressive silence, Abby asked, "What did they mine for here?" "Silver, mostly," Matthew replied. "The boom ended long before I was born. These tunnels were forgotten." He paused. "Except by Elizabeth. She had a gift for seeing value in things other people threw away." They walked on, the tunnel beginning to slope gently upward. Abby's legs ached. Her nursing shoes were not made for this, but she didn't complain. Every step was a step away from Daniel. Finally, Matthew held the lantern high. There, ahead of them, a rickety wooden ladder rose through a hole in the ceiling, disappearing into the blackness above. It was the ventilation shaft. "I'll go first," Matthew said, taking the lantern. "Test the rungs." He started to climb. Each rung groaned and creaked under his weight, and Abby held her breath, praying they would hold. Then it was her turn. The climb was dizzying, a straight ascent up through solid rock. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. Just as she thought she couldn't go on, her head bumped against a wooden trapdoor. Matthew pushed. It was stuck. He pushed again, grunting with effort. With a screech of protesting hinges, it lifted, and a wave of fresh air and the soft glow of firelight washed over them. A weathered face appeared in the opening. A man in his 60s, with a silver beard and eyes as sharp as flint. "About time," he said, his voice a low grumble. "Thought I might have to come looking for you." It was Jacob Miller. He helped them up into a small, one-room cabin that was impossibly cozy. A fire roared in a stone hearth. Furs covered the floor. He handed them each a cup of steaming venison stew. "Doc said you're heading to Helena," Miller said, settling into a chair across from them, "looking for the federal marshal." Matthew nodded. "I have evidence, enough to put my brother away for life." Miller's weathered face hardened. "About time someone stood up to that snake." His gaze shifted to Abby. "And you? How do you fit into all this?" "I'm a nurse," she said simply. "I found Matthew after he was shot. The rest just happened." The old prospector nodded slowly. "Life has a way of putting us where we're needed, not always where we plan to be." He stood and went to a large trunk in the corner. "You'll need proper gear for the journey. It's 3 days to Helena through the tunnels if you're lucky." "We can pay you," Matthew started. Miller cut him off. "I owed Elizabeth my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And Rebecca, she saved my daughter from one of Daniel's camps 2 years back." He looked at Matthew, his eyes fierce. "Consider my debt paid. Just make sure Daniel hangs for what he did." As Miller sorted through supplies, heavy coats, boots, dried rations, Abby leaned closer to Matthew. His daughter? She whispered. Many of the women they helped were local girls, Matthew explained quietly. Daughters of miners, ranchers. Daniel's evil runs deep in this valley. They were supposed to rest, to leave at first light, but just as they were settling in, a new sound cut through the night. Faint but unmistakable, the distant baying of hounds. Miller was at the window in an instant. Tracking dogs, he said, his voice a grim whisper. They must have followed your scent from Elizabeth's cabin, even in the storm. Abby's blood ran cold. The tunnels wouldn't save them. The dogs would follow their scent right to the trap door. They were cornered. We have to split them up, Miller said, already grabbing his rifle and a pack. Give them too many trails to follow. I'll lead them west toward the old Blackwood mine. You two head east through the tunnels. Surface at a place called Devil's Gulch. There's an abandoned trapper's cabin there. Rest for one night, then push on to Helena. They'll kill you if they catch you, Abby protested. A fierce grin split Miller's beard. Been playing hide and seek in these mountains my whole life, Missy. Let's see if Daniel's boys can keep up. The barking was getting louder, closer. Now they could hear men's voices shouting. Go! Miller urged, pushing them toward the trapdoor. Now! They scrambled down the ladder, plunging back into the cold, silent darkness of the earth. Matthew pulled the trapdoor shut behind them, cutting off the firelight, the sound of the dogs, everything. They were alone again, with 10 miles of treacherous, unmapped tunnels ahead of them, and a pack of killers hunting them from above. This way, Matthew whispered, his voice tight with urgency. They lit the small lantern Miller had given them and started walking east, deeper into the crushing blackness of the mountain. Time ceased to exist. There was only the tunnel, the small, flickering circle of light from their lantern, and the constant, oppressive silence. They walked for what felt like days, pausing only to drink water and eat the hard biscuits Miller had given them. And then they heard it. Far behind them, echoing strangely in the stone passages, came the faint sound of dogs barking. Matthew extinguished the lantern in an instant, plunging them into a terrifying, absolute blackness. Abby felt his hand find hers in the dark, his grip like iron. They're in the tunnels, he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. The barking grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. Then they saw it, a faint, distant glow reflecting off the damp tunnel walls. Lanterns, and with the light came the sound of men's voices. Here, Matthew hissed, pulling her into a narrow side passage, a tiny crack in the rock wall. They crouched in the darkness, barely breathing as the lights grew stronger. The dogs were going crazy, their excited barks echoing painfully in the confined space. They've lost the scent, a man's voice grumbled, so close that Abby could have reached out and touched him. This damn water washed it away. Keep looking, another man commanded. Daniel wants Blackwood found. Today. The lights and voices passed their hiding spot and continued down the main tunnel. Abby didn't dare breathe until the glow had faded completely, the barking no more than a distant murmur. That was too close, she whispered, her body trembling. Too close, Matthew agreed. We can't go back to the main tunnel. We have to try this side passage. It was a huge risk. The side tunnel was smaller, the timber supports older and rotting. It wasn't on their map. They were walking blind, but they had no choice. They moved in total darkness now, unwilling to risk lighting their lantern again. One hand on the rough wall, the other stretched out in front of them, they shuffled forward into the unknown. The tunnel narrowed until they were forced to stoop, the air growing stale and thin. Just as Abby started to think they had made a fatal mistake, the tunnel opened up into a vast, cavernous chamber. An old mining operation, abandoned decades ago. Rusted ore carts sat on forgotten rails. Tools lay on workbenches, coated in a thick layer of dust, as if the miners had just walked away mid-shift. Matthew risked lighting the lantern again. He spread their map out on a workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think we're here, he said, pointing to a spot marked North Star Claim. But I don't see any passage connecting to Devil's Gulch. We're cut off. Abby's heart sank. So we're lost. Not lost, he corrected. a grim smile on his face. Just temporarily uncertain of our exact route. Before she could reply, a low rumble vibrated through the chamber. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The ancient timbers groaned. "What was that?" Abby asked, her voice tight with alarm. "Cave in," Matthew said, his eyes scanning the ceiling nervously. Another rumble, louder this time. A massive timber directly above them cracked with a sound like a gunshot. "Move!" Matthew yelled, grabbing her arm. "Now!" They ran, scrambling along the rusted rails as the ceiling behind them began to collapse. Rocks and earth thundered down, filling the passage they had just come through. The air filled with a thick, choking cloud of dust. They dove through an opening on the far side of the chamber, just as the entire ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. They found themselves in a new tunnel, this one different. The walls were smoother, the floor sloped gently downward. "It's a drainage tunnel," Matthew said, his voice filled with a new hope. "It has to lead to the surface." They followed it for what felt like another lifetime. The air grew fresher, and then they saw it, a silvery rectangle of light in the distance. They stumbled toward it, their legs weak with relief, and emerged from behind a frozen waterfall into a narrow snow-filled canyon. "Devil's Gulch," Matthew breathed, consulting the map one last time. The trapper's cabin should be just a mile downstream. They had made it. They had survived the tunnels. They had escaped the cave-in. For the moment, they were safe. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, but after their ordeal, it felt like a palace. Matthew built a fire while Abby took stock of their supplies. As warmth finally began to seep back into her frozen limbs, she found herself watching him, the exhaustion etched on his face, the grim determination in his eyes. He caught her looking at him. "You should rest," she said quickly. "I'll keep watch." He nodded, too tired to argue, and stretched out on the narrow cot. Soon his breathing evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Abby sat by the window, the revolver Dr. Winters had given her resting on her lap. Outside, the world was silent and peaceful. She pulled the silver locket from her pocket and opened it, staring at the inscription. "Time reveals truth." It was a strange thought, but she felt like she was finally discovering who she was supposed to be. Not a lonely nurse running from her past, not a mail-order bride walking into a trap, but a woman who could face down killers, navigate collapsed minds, and fight for what was right. A woman who had found a purpose and a partner in the most unlikely of places. Tomorrow they would push on to Helena. Tomorrow they would face whatever came next. But tonight, in this tiny, forgotten cabin, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. And as the first gentle snowflakes of a new storm began to fall outside, she realized something else. She wasn't just fighting to save Matthew or to get justice for Elizabeth and Rebecca. She was fighting for him, for the quiet strength in his eyes, for the shared understanding that had grown between them in the darkness. It was a fragile, dangerous feeling, but it was real. The final leg of their journey was a desperate race against the elements. A new blizzard was closing in, a dark wall of clouds devouring the mountains behind them. They pushed themselves to the breaking point, scrambling along a high, narrow ridge path that offered the best cover but the most treacherous footing. Helena was so close, a smudge of smoke on the horizon, but the storm was faster. The first gunshot was almost lost in the howl of the wind, a sharp crack that could have been a tree branch snapping under the weight of the snow. But Matthew's reaction was instantaneous. "Down!" he screamed, tackling her, sending them both tumbling into a deep snowdrift as a second bullet splintered the bark of a pine tree right where her head had been. "Sniper! On the ridge!" he yelled over the wind. "We need cover!" They scrambled through the deep snow, crashing through the dense forest as more shots kicked up puffs of white around them. Behind them, they could hear shouts. It wasn't just one man. It was a hunting party. Daniel's men had somehow gotten ahead of them. Matthew spotted a jumble of massive boulders, a natural fortress in the middle of the woods. They dove behind it just as a volley of bullets ricocheted off the stone with terrifying, whining shrieks. "6 shots," Matthew said, checking his rifle. "We have to make them count." Abby pulled out the small revolver. Her hands were steady. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her training took over. Focus on the threat. Stay alive. Shadows moved through the trees, closing in. Matthew's rifle cracked, and a man screamed in the swirling snow. A figure burst from the trees on her left, and Abby fired without thinking. The revolver bucked in her hand, and the man went down, clutching his leg. Gunfire erupted from all sides, pinning them down. They were trapped. If the bullets didn't get them, the cold would. The storm was getting worse, visibility dropping to almost nothing. "The storm!" Abby yelled. "It's our only chance. If we both run now, they won't be able to see us." Matthew didn't hesitate. "On my signal, run east, straight for the gulch. Don't stop and don't look back." He fired his last few rounds in different directions, creating a momentary confusion. "Now!" They burst from cover, running for their lives as bullets whizzed past them in the whiteout. Abby ran until her lungs burned like fire, until her legs were numb. The ground suddenly dropped away, and Matthew grabbed her just before she plunged over the edge of a steep ravine. They slid down the snowy slope, the wind and snow covering their tracks, and landed in a heap at the bottom. They were in a deep gulch, sheltered from the worst of the storm. For a moment there was silence. No shouts, no gunshots. They had lost them. "Helena," Matthew gasped, pointing downstream. "The gulch leads right to the edge of the city, maybe 2 miles." 2 miles, it felt like 1,000. They stumbled on, half frozen, driven by sheer will. When Abby fell, Matthew pulled her up. When he stumbled, she held him steady. They were a single entity, bound by their shared desperation. The lights of Helena appeared through the snow like a miracle. They emerged from the gulch at the edge of town and found a small, discreet hotel. The room was warm. It was safe. As Abby hung their frozen coats by the fire, the reality of what they had just survived washed over her, and she began to tremble uncontrollably. Matthew knelt in front of her, taking her icy hands in his. "We made it, Abby," he said, his voice soft. "We made it." "The evidence," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Do you still have it?" He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a small oilskin packet. "Right here," he said, "close to my heart." He was about to put it away when he paused. He unwrapped the packet. Inside, nestled with the ledgers and documents, was something else. A small, worn photograph. The picture from Elizabeth's cabin, of her and a 5-year-old Matthew. "Why do you have this?" Abby asked. "Elizabeth gave it to me years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me to look at it whenever I forgot what we were fighting for." He looked from the photo to Abby, and his eyes were filled with a raw, powerful emotion. "It's not just about justice anymore, Abby. It's about building something better. Something they would have been proud of." He took her hand, his thumb gently tracing circles on her palm. "First thing tomorrow, we go to the marshal. We end this. Together." The federal marshal's office was a sturdy brick building in the center of town. Marshal Collins was a man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When Matthew finally placed the packet of evidence on his desk, the marshal nodded slowly. "Daniel Blackwood," he said, his voice like gravel. "I've been hearing rumors about his operation for years, but I never had anything solid to act on." He looked at Matthew, his eyes sharp. "Until now." Relief washed through Abby, so powerful it almost made her knees buckle. They had done it. "There's something else you need to know," the marshal said, his face hardening. "Daniel Blackwood arrived in Helena yesterday. He and a dozen of his men are staying at the Grand Hotel, right down the street." The air left Abby's lungs. They had run all this way, survived so much, only to walk right into the lion's den. Daniel was here, in the same city. "He's not here for railroad business," Collins said grimly. "He's here to find that evidence, and to make sure neither of you ever get the chance to talk." He gathered the documents. "I need to get warrants, organize my deputies. Until I have him in custody, you two are in extreme danger. My home is on the edge of town. My wife will keep you safe there. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the house." That evening, from the window of the marshal's guest room, they watched as Collins and a small army of deputies marched down the street toward the Grand Hotel. Minutes later, they emerged, escorting a man in handcuffs. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking him. Daniel Blackwood. As they led him away, he suddenly stopped, his head turning, his eyes scanning the street as if he could feel their presence. His gaze swept past them, then snapped back, locking directly onto Matthews. Across the snowy street, the two brothers stared at each other, one in chains, his empire crumbling, the other standing free, having brought the monster to justice. A slow, cold smile spread across Daniel's face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a promise of revenge. Then the deputies pushed him forward, and he was gone. "It's over," Abby whispered, leaning her head on Matthew's shoulder. "No," Matthew said, his voice low and strange. "It's just the beginning." That night, lying in the darkness of the guest room, sleep was impossible. "What happens now?" Abby asked into the silence. "We go back," Matthew said. "We use what's left of the Blackwood land, what Daniel didn't sell or ruin, and we build what Rebecca always wanted, a sanctuary, a real home for women who need a safe place to start over." He turned to her in the darkness, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I can't do it alone." He paused, and the air between them was electric. "Stay, Abby. Stay and help me build it." The woman who had arrived in Montana seeking a loveless marriage to escape her past had found something else entirely. A purpose. A fight. And in the eyes of the man beside her, a future she never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered, her hand finding his in the dark. "Yes, I'll stay." 5 years later, the Blackwood Ranch was unrecognizable. The grim, imposing symbol of Daniel's corruption had been transformed into a place of light and hope. Small, neat cabins dotted the landscape. Fields once barren were now lush with crops. In the center of it all, a schoolhouse stood, its windows bright with lamplight, the sound of children's laughter spilling out into the crisp autumn air. Abby stood on the porch of her home, the same small cabin where she had saved Matthew's life, and watched him swing their 3-year-old daughter, a little girl with her father's startling blue eyes, named Elizabeth Hannah Blackwood. Their life was one of quiet purpose. The network Elizabeth had started was now a thriving, open operation, supported by the territory government. Abby and Dr. Winters ran an infirmary on the ranch, and Matthew oversaw it all, a quiet, steady leader who had turned the ashes of his family's dark past into a beacon of hope for hundreds of women. Daniel Blackwood was dying. Consumption, they called it. A slow, wasting disease that was eating him alive in a federal prison 100 miles away. A letter had come from the governor, an official inquiry. Did Matthew wish to see his brother one last time? "You don't have to go," Abby said, her hand covering his as they sat by the fire that night. "I do," he said, his voice heavy. "Not for him, for me." He traveled to Helena alone. The prison was a grim, gray fortress. Daniel was a ghost, a skeleton stretched out on a cot, the fire in his eyes all that was left of the powerful man he had once been. "You came," he rasped, a dry, rattling cough shaking his withered frame. "Come to gloat?" "I came to understand," Matthew said. For an hour they talked. Daniel spoke of their father, of a deep-seated jealousy and a desperate need to prove himself that had curdled into a monstrous ambition. He showed no remorse, no regret. He had played the game and lost. That was all. As Matthew stood to leave, Daniel's bony fingers clamped onto his wrist. "The ranch," he whispered, his eyes burning with a strange light. "The women, your child. You think it's over, don't you? You think you won." "This was never about winning or losing," Matthew said. Daniel's laugh was a horrifying, gurgling sound. "It's always about winning, little brother. Remember that." Those were the last words his brother ever spoke to him. 2 days later, Matthew was back home, the darkness of the prison behind him. He stood with Abby on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he might never let go. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked softly. "No," he said, his voice muffled in her hair. There were no answers there, no closure, just an ending. He looked out at the peaceful valley, at the lights coming on in the cabins, at the life they had built together. He died as he lived, alone, with nothing but power and hate for company. His grip tightened. Everything he built was a monument to himself. Everything we built, he trailed off, his voice thick with emotion, is a monument to them, Abby finished for him, to Elizabeth, to Rebecca, to Hannah, to all the women who had been lost, and all the women who had been saved. Time had revealed its truth. From the ashes of tragedy, they had built a promise of safety, a promise of new beginnings, a promise that even in the darkest of nights a light could be kindled. And here, in the heart of the wild Montana mountains, that light was burning brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival, justice, and the enduring power of hope.